Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to stand back a little bit so that I can try to get to both sides of to the entire room. I hope everybody is having a meaningful fast, and everyone should have an easy and meaningful rest of the day. What I wanted to do today was to do something as well connected to Shiva, Asar, TAMMUZ and the 3 weeks. And what I wanted to do was really take a step back and talk a little bit about the nature of the mourning as in M-O-U-R, the avilut that we have during these 3 weeks. Because there's a lot that we start to do over the next few weeks, beginning with Shiva, Asar, TAMMUZ until Tisha B'Av. But the truth is that the way that we commemorate the Beit HaMikdash is not simply during these 3 weeks. We focus and we highlight and we ram up the type of mourning that we have. But the truth is that the way that we relate to the Beit HaMikdash and to YERUSHALAYIM is something that we do throughout the entire year. And what I wanted to do today was to discuss what I believe is the brilliance of Chazal in creating a very, very multi-tiered and yet comprehensive, while not so intense, model of how to commemorate and how to properly mourn for the Beit HaMikdash. We'll start with source number one. Source number one is a halacha from the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch says, this is in the very, very beginning, in Siman Aleph, the first seif of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, Ra'oi lekol yirei shamayim. It is appropriate for every person who fears heaven, sheyehei meitzer v'doeg al churban Beit HaMikdash. The person should be distressed and be bothered by the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. This is an actual halacha. Again, remember, the Shulchan Aruch is a halachic book. It's not just hashkafa and emunah. And the halacha is that we as human beings, as the Jewish people, are meant to, on some level, feel a pain and feel a certain sense of distress over the loss and over the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And the question is exactly how we do that. And obviously now, as we enter Shiva, Asar, TAMMUZ and the 3 weeks, we're much more aware of the intensity and of the churban and of the type of mourning that we're meant to do. But as I mentioned, it doesn't really begin now. It just gets intensified now. And what I would like to do is really, like as I said, step back and take more of a bird's eye view on the multi-tiered model that Chazal have created for how we are meant to mourn the Beit HaMikdash. And mourn can mean different things at different points during the year. And what we see is that Chazal in their brilliance really created something that enables us to be aware of the destruction throughout the year, but not necessarily be overwhelmed with it. At certain times, intensify that mourning. Different ways that we intensify that mourning. Different ways that we commemorate it versus mourn it. And as I said, I think it's really, really amazing to see that balance when you step back and see the whole picture. There's really 4 tiers to the model that Chazal have created for how we relate to the Beit HaMikdash and to its destruction throughout the year in general. And I want to start with what I called here section number 1, mourning the past. And in order to understand mourning the past, we have to understand there's a relatively well-known Gemara in Baba Basra, source number 2, and I'd like to go through it with you. I brought the English translation for those who would like to follow along. We're going to read it in Hebrew, and I'll translate. And this Gemara really sets the stage for understanding this first level of commemoration, which we call mourning the past. Tanu Rabbanan. Our rabbis taught. Source number 2, the Gemara in Baba Basra. Kishecharav habayit hashniya. When the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabu prushim b'Yisrael shelo le'echol basar v'lo lishtot yayin. There was a group of people. They were called the prushim. The prushim, for our purposes now, were the more intense, the more religious, the more observant, and more zealot type of group of people who wanted to commemorate the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, and they decided that in order to commemorate the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, we were going to stop eating meat and drinking wine. Nitapel lahen Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua went to them, Amar lahen, and he said to them, Banai, my children, mipnei ma iatem ochlim basar ve'inatem shotim yayin. Why are you not drinking wine or eating meat? What's the reason all of a sudden, because of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, you've abstained from eating and drinking wine and meat? Amrulo, they responded, Nochal basar shmimenu makrivim al gabei hamizbeach v'achshav batel. How could we possibly eat meat? Every time we see the meat, it reminds us of the korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, which we no longer have. And therefore, how could we eat meat? Nishte yayin shemenaskim al gabei hamizbeach v'achshav batel. How could we drink wine? Wine reminds us of the nisach hamayim, the wine libations that were brought with each of the korbanot, and now it's batel. So to them, the best way to commemorate the laws of the Beit HaMikdash was to abstain from drinking wine and eating meat. Amar lahem, he responded to them, Im kain, lechem lo nochal. Shekvar batlu minachot. So then he responded to them and said, wait a second, if that's the logic that you're going to take, then we could take that logic much further. You shouldn't eat bread. Why? Because there was a time when there were certain korbanot that came from bread. The korban mincha came from bread, and if you're anything which reminds you of the Beit HaMikdash, you're going to abstain from, then you shouldn't eat bread. Efshar b'peirot. So they responded, okay, maybe you're right, we'll eat fruit. And he said, peirot lo nochal. You shouldn't eat peirot. Why? Shekvar batlu bikurim, because there was something that was brought to the Beit HaMikdash that was made of fruit, namely the bikurim. So they said, "Efshar b'peirot achirim." They said, "Oh, well, fine. So we won't eat that. We won't eat from the shivat aminim. We'll eat from other fruits." Then he said, "Mayim lo nishteh." You shouldn't drink water. Why? Shekvar batel nisuch hamayim, because there was a water libation that was brought on Sukkot, and according to your logic, you shouldn't drink water either. Shatku. He got them. And they got quiet. Amar lahem, continues Rabbi Yoshua, and he says the following thing. Banai, my children, ba'u ve'amar lachem, I want to tell you something. Shelo lit'abel kol ikar efshar. To not mourn at all is impossible. We obviously have to commemorate and mourn the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Shekvar nigzira gzira. The decree has occurred. It's been decreed, and we have to make sure to commemorate that. Ulehit abel yoter midai efshar. But if you're going to mourn too much, it's impossible. She'ein gozrin gzeira latzibor ela imkein rov hatzibor yecholim la'amod bo. There's a principle that in general Chazal will not institute a decree that is too hard for the people, for the masses to keep. Dichtiv, as the pasuk says, b'me'ira itam ne'arim ve'oti atem kovim hagoy kulo. It has to be something that the entire nation can sustain. Ela kach amru chachamim. And therefore, says Rabbi Yoshua, the rabbis actually instituted a different way to commemorate the loss of the Beit HaMikdash. What is that? Sad adim et beito b'sid. What you do is, when a person is plastering their house, mishayer bo davar muat, he should leave a little area that isn't fully finished. And many people have the minhag to do this in their homes today, where they leave a certain area of the home not fully painted, not fully plastered, to commemorate Zecher Lechorban. Ose Adam Kol Tzorkei Suda. Another thing that was instituted was that when a person prepares a meal, Mishayer Davar B'Wad, he doesn't serve everything. They leave something from not preparing everything. Now, I want to just mention practically many of the things that this Gemara is going to mention. We don't necessarily do. Some of them we do, and some of them we don't do. But it's interesting to see at least at one point these were decrees that were established by Chazal to commemorate the loss of the Beit HaMikdash. So one was leaving a certain area of your home that you don't finish. The other one was when you prepare a meal, leaving something off from the meal, Zecher L'Mikdash, or Zecher L'Chorban, sorry. Ose isha kol tachshiteha. When a woman would adorn herself with jewelry, mishayeret davar mu'at. She would leave a certain amount that she wouldn't put on, that she normally would have wanted to, that she wouldn't do. And therefore, those are the three things that are established. Number one, leaving an aspect of your home. Number two, certain part of the meal, not instituting that or not including that, not bringing everything out. And when a woman adorns herself with her jewelry, she would leave something off. Continues the Gemara. There's one more thing that we do. My al rosh simchati. What does it mean when we say in the pasuk, right? Imlo ales YERUSHALAYIM al rosh simchati. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak ze efer makleh sheberosh hachatanim. That's the ashes that we place on the head of the chatan at the time of the wedding, which again is something that most of us have the minhag to do. Amar le Rav Papa le Abaye, hechan manachlu. Where do we put it? B'makom tefillin. We put it in the place where he usually puts his tefillin. Okay, so we'll stop here now from this Gemara and just understand this fascinating conversation, because it's a very, very important conversation to understanding what was initially thought to be established and what ultimately was established. According to this Gemara, you had the Prushim. The Prushim were very, very anxious to commemorate the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in the proper way. And what did they do? They said they weren't going to eat any meat or drink any wine. Comes Rabbi Yoshua and he challenges them. He says that logic is a little bit too far, a little bit too strong. If you take that logic too far, you're going to end up not eating or drinking anything. And therefore he ends up suggesting or elaborating and bringing Chazal's understanding of what we should do, which is 4 things that we should do. Number 1, you shouldn't finish your house entirely. You should leave a little area of your house. When you prepare a meal, make sure that the meal leaves something off of the meal. When a woman adorns herself, she leaves something off. And at the moment of a wedding, to put ashes on the head of the chatan. What's going on in this conversation? How do you understand this conversation between the Prushim? What were the Prushim trying to basically do?
Keep it alive.
The Prushim were very, very, I would say, reactive. Okay, they were reactive. They were dealing with loss, and they came up with a very, very strong and very intensive type of commemoration. And what's Rabbi Yeshua's response? Rabbi Yeshua's response happens to be, interestingly enough, very nuanced. Because on the one hand, he limits the observance, but he also expands the observance. Why? Because on the one hand, he says to them, guys, if your logic, not eating meat, not drinking wine, that's too much. No one's going to be able to do that. You're asking too much.
That was for a whole year.
No, this was meant to be until Ad Sheyibane Beit HaMikdash. Ad Sheyibane Beit HaMikdash. This was what they were going to do to commemorate the loss of the Beit HaMikdash. They weren't going to eat it. So he basically said to them, that's too much. The people can't handle that. So on the one hand, he limits it and says, guys, we can't do that. On the other hand, the Prushim's reaction was only limited to one area. What was that one area? Food. And now comes Rabbi Yeshua and says, on the one hand, we can't do something so intense, it's going to be too much. On the other hand, it can only be that our observance is limited to food. It needs to be something much more encompassing. So on the one hand, it can't be as intensive, it can't be as big as not eating meat for the rest of my life. Like most of us know that would be a big challenge, not eating meat, right? As it is 9 days of not eating meat is hard enough, right? Everyone's making a siyum because we can't eat meat for 9 days. But imagine not to eat meat, not to drink wine, that's too much, says Rabbi Yeshua. On the other hand, we need to expand it. It's not just going to be in food. It's also going to be in our home. It's also going to be at our celebrations. It's also going to be in the things we wear, where we have to be able to touch upon remembering the loss of the Beit HaMikdash in all the different areas of what we do, but it's not going to be as intensive. The question that I would love to hear, I'm curious to hear, why do you think they chose those 4? Let's go to those 4. At a wedding, food, home, and a woman in a dress. What's common? Why do you think they chose those 4 areas? Happy occasions. Excellent. Good. Any other ideas?
Those are areas where you can go to excess.
What do you mean?
Excess.
Okay, so in terms of proportion, it's about. Although you should know that the way that they're describing it is more describing it as whatever you would normally do a little bit less. It's almost as if it's saying even for those who don't necessarily do too much, you should still do. I think the point of the simcha is an important one, and it very much is connected to im lo alet YERUSHALAYIM al rosh simchati. Meaning, if you think about it, building a home is one of the happiest moments in a family, in a couple's life. Having a home, building a home, mealtime is a celebratory time. When do people adorn themselves? During times of happiness, and it's dafka at those moments. The muscle that I always like to use, which I'm sure many of us can relate to, is whenever you get to a family simcha, and inevitably the person who gets up to speak talks not just about who's there, but those who are not there. And you have to mention them and remember that it's only off of their shoulders and everything that's happening here is here. It's the same idea. It's like whenever we're going to have a celebration, we have to recognize at that same time YERUSHALAYIM. That whenever we're at a moment of celebration, bidyuk, imlo alet YERUSHALAYIM al rosh simchati. At my moment of happiness, that is when I have to make sure to remember YERUSHALAYIM. The other thing that I think I would point out is I think each of these are, except the wedding being the one exception, are moments of constancy. They come up all the time. The home is something, when a person has an area of their home that they leave, usually the minhag is to leave it by the door. It's something, hopefully, that is constant. Meals are things that we have all the time. So this is an opportunity to incorporate, not in an intense way, to incorporate in a meaningful, but not too intense way, to incorporate the thinking about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Yes?
So another way to think about these 4
having the past weigh that.
Excellent. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. She said that what's common about them is that all four are not just about the past, but we're looking towards the future. And therefore, the idea is not to just be weighed back by the past, but to also be things for the future. And we're going to get to that because I think Chazal are very deliberate about how they do that. So we have this first tier, this first part of the model of how Chazal want us to commemorate, and it's what's known as in Chazal as Zecher L'Churban, commemorating the destruction. We want to commemorate the destruction. We want to mourn the destruction. And as we see, Chazal are very deliberate in how they do that. How they do it, it can't be too intense, but it has to be meaningful. I'm thinking of the word big enough. Expansive enough. Thank you. All-encompassing, expansive enough. Expansive enough to also be meaningful and something that we think about on a relatively consistent basis. Now, again, also just as I mentioned, not everything that we mentioned halachically nowadays lamaisa is something that we all do. Very often, the ashes and specifically leaving the area of the home are things that technically, generally, many people do nowadays. The other two, with the meals and with the jewelry, is less commonly observed. And we don't necessarily paskin like that, but it is interesting to know that was part of the initial model that Chazal established. So we have one tier. One tier is called what I call mourning the past, Zecher L'Churban. But there's a totally different model that is what we call a parallel opposite, parallel to Zecher L'Churban, and it is known as in Chazal not Zecher L'Churban, but what we call Zecher L'Mikdash. What's the difference between Zecher L'Churban and Zecher L'Mikdash? On the one hand, they're very parallel, but they're almost opposites. Zecher L'Churban is where we commemorate the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Zecher L'Mikdash is where we commemorate the beauty of what was. We commemorate the Beit HaMikdash in all of its glory. We think about it. We try to remember what it was like. And we commemorate the incredible edifice of the Beit HaMikdash and everything that it represented. And that is section number 2. Section number 2 are a number of examples where in Chazal, the halacha will dictate that we do something, and the reason we do it is not to commemorate the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, but to remember how things were done in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. Look at source number 3. Source number 3, the Gemara is discussing how we're supposed to eat the matzah on Pesach. Okay? So the Gemara talks about whether if many of us are familiar with the opinion of Hillel. Hillel, right? We say Zecher L'Mikdash Kil. When do we eat the Hillel sandwich? Afikomin. Hillel and the Rabbanan had a machlokas as to how the matzah and the maror and the meat were eaten on Pesach night. According to Hillel, they were all eaten together, and according to the Chachamim, they were eaten separately. So says the Gemara in source number 3, Hashta de lo itmar hilchasa lo ki Hillel velo k'Rabbanan. Since the Gemara has not yet established whether the halacha is like Hillel or it's like the Rabbanan, how we're supposed to eat the matzah and the maror. So what do? We do both, right? Mevarech al achilat matzah, we make a bracha on the matzah, ve'achil, and we eat it. Ve'hadar mevarech al achilas maror, and then we make a bracha on the maror and eat that separately. Ve'hadar achil matzah v'chasa v'hadei adadi v'lo bracha, and then we eat the matzah and the maror together. We don't make a special bracha because we already made a bracha on the matzah and on the maror separately. Why do we do this? Zecher L'Mikdash k'Hillel. What we're doing is we're commemorating, according to Hillel, what was done during the times of the Beit HaMikdash, in order to remember it, in order to commemorate it, in order to celebrate what was done. That's one example. Another example is actually the taking of the lulav during the times of the Chagim. The Mishnah in source number 4, Barishona haya lulav nital b'mikdash Shiva over Medina yom echad. Most people don't know this, but in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, they used to take the lulav. The shaking of the lulav was done 7 days only in the Beit HaMikdash, and according to some opinions, in all of YERUSHALAYIM. And outside of YERUSHALAYIM, we only took it on the first day. The shaking of the lulav, what we do every day now on Sukkot, used to only be done in YERUSHALAYIM every day, and it was done one day outside of YERUSHALAYIM. Mishecharav Beit HaMikdash, once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Hitkin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheyehe lulav nital b'medina shiv'ah. Once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai established that the lulav should be taken 7 days. Why 7 days? Zecher lemikdash. That we do nowadays what they used to do only in the mikdash, or according to the Rambam in all of Yerushalayim, to commemorate what was done. That also is another example of where we're changing what we do nowadays to commemorate what was done based on the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And one final example. This is now discussing the Sfirat HaOmer. I just want to, forgive me, I want to make sure that okay. This Gemara is discussing Sfirat HaOmer. There's a question whether we're supposed to count weeks or count days. What do? Both. Very good, right? We're good Jews. We try to, whenever we're not sure what to do, just do both. Gufa, Amar Abaye. Abaye says, mitzvah lemimne yomei, u'mitzvah lemimne shvuei. Abaye says there's a mitzvah to count weeks, and there's also a mitzvah to count days. Rabbanan debei Rav Ashai, manu yomei, u'manu shvuei. Rabbanan debei Rav Ashai, they agreed with Abaye, and they used to count both days and weeks. Ameimar, mani yomei, v'lo mani shvuei. Ameimar counted only days and not weeks. Amar zecher lemikdash. Ameimar thought that nowadays our obligation is much of a lower level than it was based in the back of the time of the Beit HaMikdash. We're only doing it zecher lemikdash. And therefore he said we only need to count days and not weeks. Without getting into the different opinions here, we see another example of where, at least according to one opinion, we change what we do. We do it a little bit differently in order to commemorate what was done in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. So this is what I called celebrating the past. Okay, as opposed to Zecher the Churban, where we're mourning the destruction. We're not mourning. Here the focus isn't on the destruction. The focus is on the incredible Mikdash that was. We want to remember what it was like, remind ourselves of that beauty, and hopefully incorporate that into our observance of what we're doing. It's interesting to note that all three examples, and these aren't the only examples, but what's common about all these examples? What are they connected to? Holidays, the Chagim, right? One was the discussion on Pesach, one was on Sukkot, one was Sfirat HaOmer, which is very much connected to Pesach and Shavuot. And here you have another example of, again, during those moments where we want to tap into the Mikdash. We want to tap into the Zecher LeMikdash. But there's another element to Zecher LeMikdash which needs to be stressed. Because when we talk about Zecher LeMikdash, we're not just celebrating the past. There's another step. Look at source number 6. Source number 6. The Gemara says the following. This is a Gemara in Sukkah. Minalan de avdinan zecher lemikdash. How do we know that we're supposed to do zecher lemikdash? What's our source for this idea that we're supposed to do certain actions to commemorate the mikdash? Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says the Amar Kra. The pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, Ki a'ale aruka lecha umimakotecha erpaecha. I will heal you from your makot. Ne'um Hashem ki nidchu karu lach Tzion, because you have been pushed away. Karu lach Tzion hi. They call you Tzion. Daresh ein la. Nobody is seeking it. Continues the Gemara. Daresh ein la. There is no one who is seeking it. Who's it? It's referring to Tzion. Says the Gemara. Michlal debaya drisha. That implies that we need to be a part of what's called the drisha for Tzion. What does it mean to be a Doresh Tzion? Doresh Tzion was the name of the early Zionists. What's a Doresh Tzion in this context? Anyone know? What does drisha mean?
Demand.
To seek, demand, exactly, demand, to seek. Meaning, what's being referenced here is that part of our Zecher Lemikdash is a certain seeking for what? To have it again. Exactly. So we're not simply, when we say Tzion hi doresh ein la michlal debay drisha, what we're saying is the purpose of Zecher LeMikdash. The goal of commemorating the past is not to be like, oh, that was nice. Good times. It's to be like, that was nice. We want to see it again. To create a sense of what we call drisha, a yearning. That's probably even the better word. Drisha is yearning, a yearning for that once again. And look at this beautiful passage that I brought for you in source number 7 from Rav Rimon, Rav Yossi Rimon in a Mizrahi magazine a couple of years ago. Says Rav Rimon, why do we need a verse to teach us that we must make a Zecher LeMikdash? Shouldn't it be obvious? Meaning, again, what's this Gemara? The Gemara telling us to commemorate the Mikdash. It was the center of everything. Why do we need a pasuk to teach us that we should commemorate it? It seems that the verse is not simply allowing us to create a Zecher LeMikdash, it is defining what Zecher LeMikdash actually is. The simple understanding of Zecher LeMikdash is that we remember what we once had in the past. But with remembering, there's a great danger. In general, most people remember things that existed in the past and can no longer exist in the present and future. The most prominent example of such remembering is a Remembrance Day for someone who has died. Of course, we look forward to the revival of the dead, but in the simplest, most immediate sense, it is a day of remembering the past. When you remember somebody, you remember what was, and you think about the fond days. You're not necessarily thinking anything towards the future. The verse clarifies that remembering Jerusalem is not a remembering of the past. I would say not just a remembering of the past, but rather a looking ahead to the future. YERUSHALAYIM ba'i drisha. YERUSHALAYIM requires seeking out. We remember in order to seek out and to demand. To remember at all times that Jerusalem is ours, that she will, God willing, in the future be returned to entirely to us. This is not merely remembering the past, but yearning and seeking out. A cry of, may the Mikdash soon be rebuilt. And so this second category, we have the first category called Zecher L'Chorban, mourning the past. The second category is not simply remembering the past, but I would call it, if you look at the back at the title I gave to it, it was remembering the past and anticipating or looking towards the future. Now, these two models that Chazal have created, the first two models that we've said so far, Zecher LaMikdash and Zecher LaChurban, as we've noted, are on some level almost opposites, but they also work together in very, very beautiful ways. If you think about it, the idea of remembering the destruction versus remembering what was is very, very common in many other ways whenever we talk about commemorating any kind of loss. Think about for a second, there's a big debate regarding the best way to commemorate the Holocaust, or the best way for Holocaust. I've been on a number of Holocaust trips, and there's always a tension that any Holocaust trip has to have, which is how much do you focus on the destruction, and how much do you focus on visiting the communities and remembering and learning about what was? How much do you focus on just going and trying to elicit emotion from seeing the concentration camps and the death camps and understanding everything? And how much do you want to go to Gore? And do you want to go to Kutsk? Do you want to go to all these places and understand what was? Those are both very important, and it's always about finding that balance. And different people and different trips will find. I vividly remember that I went on one trip when I was a senior. It was called March of the Living, and their focus was very much on the destruction. A couple of years later, I went with my yeshiva here in Israel, and the focus was much more on, both had both, but it was much more focusing on understanding the communities that were. And so both of them are very, very important. And in fact, if you look here, source number 8, Rabbi Norman Lamb references both of these models when discussing the big debate regarding how to properly commemorate 9/11. And specifically commemorating Ground Zero, the area of where the destruction happened. We'll read it quickly, just because I think, his words are much better than mine, and he has a very beautiful way of describing it. Source number 8. Let me now turn to the question of what shall we remember, and how do we remember? There's a great debate that is still raging as recently as this morning's newspapers, and it has been raging for the past year here in New York City. How and what shall we do to remember the tragic events of September 11th, 2001? There are two opinions about the story. One of them is that the place should be left as it is, destitute except for a museum or a monument, an everlasting reminder of the cruelty that struck us, and an everlasting tribute to the close to 3,000 people who were killed, the 300 who are still alive, but who were wounded for life, and the thousands upon thousands of relatives and friends who will never forget this day of infamy, and who were wounded psychologically and emotionally. There is an opposing attitude, and that is just the reverse. They are saying, yes, it is important to remember the tragedy, but we Americans are optimistic, and we have to go ahead and forge our own future, and not allow ourselves to be dragged down by this one terrorist strike. And if we have to rebuild, then let us rebuild. If this was the financial capital of the world, it must again become the financial capital of the world. We must show that we are not only going to survive, we are going to thrive, and that we will not allow the terrorists to determine our future. So which one ought we to emphasize? The recollection of the tragedy or the overcoming of the tragedy? Historically, we Jews have experienced both, each in its own context. These two themes are called Zecher LeChorban, in memory of the Chorban, and the other one is Zecher LeMikdash, in memory of the temple itself. Zecher LeChorban emphasized the pessimistic, the negative thinking. We remember the pain, the shame, the national anguish. We must never forget. We owe it to the people who were destroyed. We owe it to the people that was ravished. We owe it to the people of Israel who had to suffer through this national cataclysm. The other memory was Zecher LeMikdash. We will never forget the beauty of the temple. We will never banish from our collective memory the glory, the sanctity, the holiness of the temple, the service that took place, and how it united our people. and therefore our hope that it will be reestablished, rebuilt, and resurrected. Hence, we have these two divergent themes struggling with each other. On the one hand, we remember the negative, the destruction. On the other hand, we recall the beauty, the glory, and our unrepressed and eternal hope to overcome the destruction and relive our ancient glory. So the arguments, both Talmudic and contemporary, are reflections of the deeper ambivalence of the universal human psyche, the universal human mind and heart concerning catastrophes, whether natural or man-made. As a result, we have paradoxical reactions. On the one hand, deep grief, mourning, bordering on despair, a sense of defeat. On the other hand, defiance, struggle, healing, hope, and the striving to overcome and reattain the glory that once was. This morning's New York Times quoted something that in New York Mayor's Mayor Michael Bloomberg, said, and which is similar to what we have been saying. We'll mourn in the morning, and in the afternoon, or in the evening, we'll rededicate ourselves to rebuild. I agree with him almost completely about both themes, but they are not separate, with one period of mourning and then forgetting the mourning and going on to the rebuilding. Rather, both tendencies must coexist simultaneously. Zecher l'churban and zecher l'mikdash. We cannot afford to dispense with either of them. As we mourn those who did not survive the World Trade Center attacks, our hearts go out to those who were injured and who lost precious relatives. We keep both tendencies in mind. We realize that we Americans are a proud people. We must determine that this awful and dreadful anti-human event must be preserved in collective consciousness of America. But the memory of the destruction must not dominate us for all of the future. Indeed, the Zecher l'Churban as we go on must be transformed dialectically into its opposite, into Zecher l'Mikdash. And the Zecher l'Mikdash can never afford to express itself without always having at its side the Zecher l'Churban. That is the way of maturity, that is the way of the sages, the guardians of our heritage, understood the reaction to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and how we must understand the reactions to any and all such catastrophes. And so Rabbi Lamb beautifully captures the relationship between these two. That whereas, as he quotes, Mayor Bloomberg suggested we start with one and then we shift to the other. As Rabbi Lamb points out, it's not about one or the other. It's about finding a way to integrate the two of them together. And we shift from one to the other. Sometimes our emotions are more the Zecher l'Mikdash, and sometimes our emotions are more Zecher l'Churban. And I'm sure, as many of you have probably thought about it, the more that we think about Zecher l'Mikdash and how great the Beit HaMikdash was, the greater the sadness will be when we transition or when we shift into the Zecher l'Churban. Because if we remember and better remember what was, then the destruction itself takes on deeper meaning. And so you have these two emotions that I think are ever present and really kind of playing off each other. And as I said, Chazal created these things to be ever present throughout the year. These are two models that aren't limited to the 3 weeks. They're not limited to specific time. They're always there, but they're subtle. They're meant to be there in ways that aren't overbearing, but that are constantly able to remind us of that lack that is there. And one other model that I would bring for this, which is just, bringing it more to modern days, there's many discussions, specifically today, following the horrors of October 7th. I've heard about this, many kibbutzim, specifically ones that are down south. I mean, in terms of a national way of commemorating things, I think we're still very much in it, and no one's really ready to talk about how to commemorate it. But I know, and I've read about how in many of the kibbutzim, where some of them have gone down south, and some of them have started to go back, and some of them are discussing, how do you rebuild? Do we leave the areas of destruction? Do we create a museum to commemorate what happened? Or do we just put everything to the side and just rebuild and show we won't let them get to us. We're going to rebuild and we're going to build new communities. And each kibbutz that was impacted is going to have to find that right balance. But it's always going to be the balance between these two, between the Zecher l'Churban, the destruction itself, and the Zecher l'Mikdash, meaning remembering what they had before, and looking to rebuild that in greater ways. So anytime we deal with tragedy, these two things are there. Those are the first two parts of our model, Zecher l'Churban and Zecher l'Mikdash. But there are two more major parts to this model that Chazal have beautifully created. The third I call anticipating the future. Now this tier in our model is very, very much muted. We don't find ourselves commemorating it in many active ways, but at the same time, the vision that it creates is something that's incredibly inspiring. And I'll explain what I mean. Just to get a background before we get to the source number, I just realized that the source is a little bit off, or they are. I apologize. It looks like there's I apologize if the numbering is a little bit off. We're going to 8. I don't know if it's the second 8 or the third 8. Second 8. The second 8. Okay, if it works good, it's basically the Gemara in Sukkah Daf Mem Aleph. I apologize if the numbering might be a little, or it could just be on my copy. It's off. Just to understand, to get some background. It's the Gemara right after Rabbi Lamb's piece. The Gemara is discussing the mitzvah of the Omer, the Korban Omer. As many of us are aware, there is a halacha called Chadash. Well, there's a category of Chadash and Yashan, and according to the halacha, we are only allowed to eat from the new grain, which is called Chadash, only when the Korban Omer, the Korban, the sacrifice of the Omer was brought, which was generally brought on the second day of Pesach. And it was brought sometime during the day on the second day of Pesach. The question becomes, what happens when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed? And there's no longer any Korban Omer. So at what point are we now allowed to eat from the new grain? That's the debate in the Gemara. And the Gemara debates, and initially it says, maybe we should be able to eat from the morning of the 16th. Normally we had to wait on the 16th of Nisan, which is the second day of Pesach, until the middle of the day when the Korban was brought. Now that there's no Korban, let's start from the morning of the 16th. And then the Gemara says, no, you have to wait until the end of the 16th. Which means we can now only start eating from the new grains at the end of this day, the end of the day of the 16th, the end of the second day of Pesach. Says the Gemara, this is source number 8, V'sheyehei Yom Hanef, which means the day of, which was when the Korban Omer used to be brought, that whole day is Asar to eat Chadash, to eat the new grain. Asks the Gemara, my taima, why? Why not let us eat it from the morning of the 16th? Why do you have to wait till the end of the 16th? Says the Gemara something astounding. Says the Gemara, Meheira yibane Beit HaMikdash. We're afraid that Be'ezrat Hashem, not afraid, but afraid and not afraid, that the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt. And once the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, when are we then allowed to start eating from the new grain again? Only from when the Korban is brought, which is in the middle of the day. So if we're used to eating from the morning of the 16th, and then the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, let's say the Beit HaMikdash comes a week before Pesach, everyone's going to still think they can start eating Chadash when? From the morning of the 16th, because that's what we've been doing for years and years and years and years. But really, once the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, we can only start eating it from the middle of the day when the Korban is brought. And we're afraid, and therefore in anticipation that the Beit HaMikdash should be rebuilt b'mheira b'yameinu in our days, we instead say you have to wait until the end of the 17th, because that will ensure that no one's going to eat the Chadash, the new grain, early. If you didn't get the details of that, don't worry about it. But here's the most important part of it, which I think is incredibly inspiring and also potentially dangerous. Here you have an example where Chazal have instituted a halacha in not just, perhaps, in anticipation of what? Of the Beit HaMikdash being rebuilt. We are changing the halacha, we're establishing the halacha in a way where any given year we're expecting, this year the Beit HaMikdash will be here. That's amazing. It's not remembering the past. It's not remembering destruction. It's not remembering the past and hoping for the future. It's what I would call anticipating the future. The halacha is now basically saying, because we are concerned that next Pesach there will be a Beit HaMikdash, we have to be Bagdira to define our terms and say, only start eating Chadash at the end of the 17th, because we were afraid that people are going to get confused already this coming year on the second day of Pesach. So here you have an example where Chazal are already embedding within the halacha this vision for not just yearning for the future, but anticipating. It's going to happen. It reminds me of the famous story they say about the Chafetz Chaim that used to have a bag packed in his closet, right? He has to have a suitcase all ready to go because he was ready, right? As the phrase, as the Gemara said, Tzipita Yeshua, he was mitzapeh, he was anticipating, yearning, anticipating. I've even heard, and again, I don't know if this is true, and this is an interesting halachic question. I have heard that there are some shuls that when they get kinos, they only get paperback kinos, and they don't keep them from year to year. Why? So maybe next year. Out of the hope and the belief and the anticipation that we're not going to need it next year. Now, I have even heard, again, I'm going to quote this, I don't know if this is actual true halacha, but I have even heard that there are some halachic authorities that say that there's no mitzvah of chinuch to fast for Tisha B'Av and Shiva Asar TAMMUZ. Why? Because our hope is that by the time those children become of age, now my children did fast in anticipation of chinuch, but the vision there is incredibly inspiring. Because already the third tier of our model is not just remembering the past and remembering what was and hoping. It's saying we have to constantly be aware in our minds, it might be coming soon. Now, I mentioned this is not just inspiring, this is dangerous. Why is this dangerous? Because if you take this too far, you become very messianic. And becoming messianic, on the one hand, is very inspiring. But if you do certain things, or you say certain things, it's interesting to note that it's a very limited application in halacha. Like, this is a very one specific example where Chazal will institute this idea of anticipating the future. But they don't do it in other areas. They don't do it in many other areas because it's a dangerous type of approach. Because on the one hand, we anticipate it's going to happen, but until it comes, we have to keep working, and we have to keep assuming that it's our responsibility to work hard to make sure that it comes. And so anticipation is a fine line, where on the one hand, Chazal establish it, it's there, it's part of our model of commemorating and thinking about the Beit HaMikdash, but in a very, very limited way, because it's a dangerous potential model that we have to be very, very careful of. Which now brings us to the fourth model. The fourth tier of our model. And that is what I called mourning the present. And that actually gets into the period of time that we're now starting right now, which is the period of the 3 weeks and the 9 days in Tisha B'Av. Because until now, the three parts of our model that we've been discussing were things that exist all year round. They were at specific times, but they weren't limited to the 3 weeks and the 9 days, which is when the mourning for the Beit HaMikdash tends to be on our minds. But here we have a new level of mourning. Because we're no longer mourning the past. We're now mourning the present. And I'll explain what I mean. Look at the... Absolutely. I want to clarify. Yes, absolutely. Meaning, I would say that, there's a reason why Chazal say that Tisha B'Av is not just a day to mourn the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash was the initial destruction, but we mourn all types of tragedies. And of course, the question of whether you should have other days where you mourn those tragedies is an important question. And there's no question that for many of us, I think Tisha B'Av will have new meaning to this year than it will in the past because of what's going on. And that's 100%. 100%. There's no question about that. And I think that's healthy. Healthy meaning that's appropriate. It's appropriate because whenever we try to connect to tragedy, it's much easier to connect to tragedy that you've experienced than tragedy that happened long ago. But I want to just to highlight this piece. Look at the Gemara in source number 10. The Gemara in source number 10 makes the following very interesting comment. It discusses the act of Kriya. The act of Kriya is the act of tearing that an Avel normally does when they have a close relative that passes away. And the Gemara says the following: Elu karim she'ein mitachim. These are the following reasons why a person should tear Kriya and should not resew it afterwards. There were certain times where it was appropriate to tear Kriya, but you were allowed to resew it afterwards. But these categories that we're about to discuss right now are categories where you should tear Kriya, but you should not resew it. And what are they? Hakorea al aviv, somebody who tears kriya for their father. Ve'al imo, or for their mother. Ve'al rabo shelimdo Torah, for their rav who taught them a lot of Torah. Al nasi, for a president. Al av beit din. Again, these are referring to specific types of roles that it's hard to know whether nowadays these are the roles that still apply. Av beit din was the head of the beit din. Ve'al shmuot haraot, bad events that we hear about. Ve'al birchot Hashem, if somebody curses God's name. Ve'al sefer Torah shenisraf, and a sefer Torah that gets burnt. Ve'al arei Yehuda, and about seeing the destruction of the arei Yehuda, the area of around Yerushalayim. Ve'al Hamikdash ve'al Yerushalayim. Okay, this is a list. Now, without getting into some of the other details of this list, there's something very interesting about this list. And we're going to play a game. Which one of these is not like the other? Okay, there's a group of three that are dramatically different from the rest of this list. I'll give you a hint, it's the last three. But let's see why. What is different about those last three that are drastically different from the rest of the list?
Because they're in the past.
Excellent. What is the act of Kriya normally about? Normally, the act of Kriya is an emotive response to a tragedy that has just occurred. Right? A person tears Kriya when a close relative has just passed away, or a tragedy has just happened. A Rebbe just passed away. That is when a person normally tears. Kriya is an emotive response to an event that has just occurred. And yet, Chazal say, we're supposed to tear Kriya for YERUSHALAYIM and the Mikdash. Now again, without getting into the practical ramifications of this and whether you should tear Kriya, normally the only place that people tear Kriya nowadays is at the Kotel, and depending on how often you've been there, you should ask your local Orthodox rabbi when and where you should be doing this. But there's something incredibly important here that the Chazal are teaching us. Here you have an act which is usually only expressive of an emotional response to an event that has just happened, and yet Chazal tell us that same act we should be doing for something that happened thousands of years ago. The question is why? Why is it? Why would Chazal be expecting us, or asking of us? Meaning, it sounds almost funny. I should sit there and tear Kriya. That it's almost Kriya is an expression of my intense pain. What are Chazal teaching us?
We might forget about that.
Chazal are teaching us on some level that the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Well, there's actually two. I would say it this way. There's two ways to answer this question. Let me take a step back. There's two ways that we could explain this. One way is to suggest that, you know what? You're right. Normally, that type of reaction, that action is only done for events that happen right now. But there are certain events that are so great, so tragic, that changed our reality in such drastic ways that even though it's been thousands of years, we still take that reaction in order to show how important it is. That would probably be the simplest approach to explaining this. That the destruction of Beit HaMikdash was such a cataclysmic event that even 2,000 years later, we're supposed to try to create or elicit that sense of loss by doing an act of kriya that's normally reserved for an emotive reaction to an event that happened just now. That's one way of understanding it. But there's another way to understand it. And then in order to understand that, we have to see the next source. Source number 11. The Gemara in Yerushalmi, Maseches Yuma, says the following. Famous idea that many of you have heard. Amru, kol dor, she'eno nivne biyamav. Any generation where the Beit HaMikdash has not yet been rebuilt, ma'alin alav ki'ilu hu hechrivo. It is as if he has destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. Every generation where we have not merited or caused and been active in rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash is as if we have destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. So now let's get back to that Mishnah, to the Gemara in source number 10. Why are we tearing Kriya, taking an act which is normally reserved for immediate response to an event that just happened, if this is an event that happened 2,000 years ago? According to this Gemara, why are we doing it? It didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. It's happening right now. This is called, what I call mourning the present. The fourth part of this multi-tiered system is what we're going through now the next 3 weeks. The next 3 weeks, we are shifting from mourning the past, celebrating the past, thinking about what was, maybe even anticipating the future. We're now meant to sit with the reality of there is no Beit HaMikdash, and that is meant to create a sense of mourning in a different way. The next 3 weeks, we are now as if we were in the words of Chazal. There are two different types of avelut. They call avelut chadasha and avelut yishana. Avelut chadasha is a reference to people who have had recent loss. Usually refers to the loss of a relative. That's called avelut. It's new avelut. Avelut yishana refers to the avelut, the old mourning that we usually have during the time for the Beit HaMikdash. During these 3 weeks, we are now transitioning from what used to be Avelut Yishena, and it's now turning into Avelut Chadasha. During these 3 weeks, we are thinking about and mourning the reality that we're spent. And by the way, it's not so easy. This isn't an easy thing to do, okay? Because as we know, Avelut Chadasha is much easier to elicit that reaction because it feels very intense. We feel it in our bones. When it comes to the mourning the Beit HaMikdash, that feeling is not necessarily there. 1 second, and then I'll take your question. In fact, there's a famous idea about Rav Soloveitchik, where Rav Soloveitchik notes that the way that the 3 weeks continue, the continuum of the 3 weeks, is the exact opposite of the way that a person normally mourns for their family on what's called Avelut Chadasha. Because Avelut Chadasha usually starts with the most intensive type of experience, which is Aneinut and the Kvura, followed by the Shiva, in which you lessen some of it. Then the Shloshim, where you lessen even more, and then the year where you lessen even more. When it comes to the 3 weeks, we start with lesser type of it. We're aside from the fast of today, we take on certain restrictions now. Then the 9 days, we take on more restrictions. Then the Shavua Shechal Bo, the week of Tisha B'Av, we take on even more restrictions. And then Tisha B'Av is meant to be similar to the Yom HaKfurah, the day of the burial itself. Why is it the exact opposite? So Rav Soloveitchik notes because of the nature of the difference between these two types of experiences. When a person experiences an Avelut Chadashah, that loss, the most intense moment is the time when he experienced that loss. And then over time, although the person is not forgotten, God forbid, but the loss itself is meant to dissipate a certain amount over time. When it comes to Avelut Yishanah, mourning the Beit HaMikdash, it's not an automatic response. There's no emotive response many of us have towards the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. We need to, in the words of Soloveitchik, we need to learn it. We need to build it. We need to create it. And that's what these 3 weeks are meant to do. They're meant to help us on that path as we begin the path towards mourning on Tisha B'Av. Yes, a question or a comment?
First of all,
thank you.
No, I have no question. I was going to say this is probably the source of Jewish guilt. That we all
this is definitely an example, a good example of Jewish guilt. There's no question this is an example of Jewish guilt. But another way to say it is, I think that, and there's always a fine line between guilt and accountability. And I think that's the fine line that we have to write. We all have. I'm sure most of our when we talk about the guilt from the Jewish mom, it was never meant to be guilt. It was meant to be accountability. But sometimes there's a fine line between accountability and guilt. So just to bring it together, what we've seen so far, ladies and gentlemen, is we've seen here really in brilliant fashion the multi-tiered model that Chazal have put together for how to commemorate and relate to the Beit HaMikdash. And it really, if you think about it, it really transcends time, because we have the past, the present, and the future. We have, well, we said the first two are Zecher LeChorban and Zecher LeMikdash, the two different ways that we relate to the past. Zecher LeChorban is remembering the destruction, mourning the destruction, as well as remembering what was, as we also look towards the future. Those were the first two models. That's the past. We talked about the third tier was anticipating the future, where we have even a halakha that encourages us to think that tomorrow, in 2 weeks, right? B'chol yom sheyavo Mashiach is going to come, and there's even a halacha that is created to reflect that. And the fourth is what I would call the present, where we're mourning the present. The time that we're in right now is where we begin to really sit and take a few weeks to beginning with Shiva Asar TAMMUZ, to mourn the present, to think about it and recognize our role in the destruction, and hopefully our role, Be'ezrat Hashem, in the continued rebuilding, Be'ezrat Hashem. Have a great day, everybody, and a meaningful fast.